The house had learned to stay quiet. It had settled into a kind of muted stillness that hovered over every room like a thin layer of dust, untouched and undisturbed. Elena moved through that silence each morning with the same slow precision, as if any sudden gesture might cause something fragile inside her to crack even further. She had never imagined a home could feel so heavy, as though the air itself resisted being breathed. Her son's shoes still sat by the back door, not neatly placed, not arranged for remembrance, but exactly where he had kicked them off on the last afternoon he came home. She could not bring herself to touch them. The small scuffs on the toes, the frayed edge of one lace, every detail felt like a trap that might pull her under if she lingered too long. Most days she tried not to look at them. Most days she failed. Her routine had thinned into a handful of tasks she performed without thought. She woke before the sun, not out of discipline, but because sleep had become an unpredictable visitor. She made coffee and let it go cold. She stood by the kitchen sink for long stretches of time without doing anything at all. She moved through rooms without turning on lights, as though brightness might expose everything she was trying to outrun. The walls carried echoes she refused to acknowledge, the weight of a boy's laughter, the memory of footsteps on the stairs, the ghost of a backpack dropped on the hallway floor. Not real ghosts, just the stubborn impressions of a life that had once pulsed through the house with such effortless energy. Then came the dog. She hadn't gone looking for him. He had appeared in early winter, thin from wandering, skittish from too many nights spent outside. She found him behind the garage, digging through a toppled recycling bin. He didn't growl, didn't run, only froze with a kind of resigned expectation, as if he had learned that nothing good ever came from being seen. She understood that feeling more than she wished she did. At first, she only offered scraps, a bit of leftover chicken, a slice of bread. He would take it from a cautious distance, lowering his head before retreating. But the next morning he was there again, sitting in the same spot, eyes fixed on her with an earnest patience that felt strangely grounding. Eventually, she opened the back door wide enough for him to step inside. He hesitated, then crossed the threshold with careful, almost deliberate steps, like someone entering a place they weren't sure they were welcome. She named him simply because the vet needed something to write on the form, but she rarely used the name out loud. The dog didn't seem to mind. He learned the rhythms of the house quickly, following her from room to room without making a sound. Sometimes he rested his head against her leg. Sometimes he sat across the room, watching her as if waiting for instructions she never gave. His presence softened the edges of her days, though she would never admit it. He filled small spaces the same way warm light filled a dark hallway. Not enough to change everything, but enough to keep her moving. Yet there were parts of her life he never entered. The bedroom at the end of the hall remained closed. She avoided that door with the same instinctive recoil one might have toward an old wound. And every afternoon, when the sun began its slow descent, she felt the familiar tightening in her chest, the time of day she dreaded most, the hour that had once been defined by the sound of footsteps racing up the porch steps, the door swinging open, the breathless arrival of the only person who had ever truly felt like home. She used to time her evenings around that moment. Now she timed her grief around the absence of it. One late afternoon, as winter light stretched thin across the floorboards, the dog lifted his head abruptly. His ears shifted, his body went still. Elena barely noticed at first. She stood by the kitchen counter, hands wrapped around a mug she wasn't drinking from, lost in the familiar haze that always settled over her during that hour. But the dog's posture tugged at her attention. He rose, walked deliberately to the front hallway, and stopped in front of the door. She had seen him explore the house before, but this was different. He didn't sniff or pace or wander. He simply waited, still, alert, focused on the closed door with an intensity that tightened something deep inside her. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just watched him. It was the first time since her son's death that she had truly looked at the exact spot where he used to appear every single day. Heavy backpack on one shoulder, mud on his shoes, a half-formed grin that always softened her exhaustion. The dog stayed there until the light outside dimmed into evening. When he finally walked away, he did so quietly, as though he understood the weight of what lingered in that space. Elena tried to dismiss it as coincidence. Dogs listened to noises. Dogs waited for things they didn't fully understand. Dogs responded to patterns she wasn't aware of. But the next day, at the same hour, he moved to the door again. Same stillness, same focus, same quiet expectation. Her breath faltered the moment she saw him do it. Something raw and unfinished twisted inside her, sharp and immediate. She forced herself to turn away, but the movement felt like stepping through water, slow, labored. By the third day, it was impossible to pretend she didn't feel something unraveling. She tried distracting herself with chores she had abandoned months ago, folding laundry she didn't need, rearranging items on the kitchen counter, wiping clean surfaces that were already spotless. But each small motion felt clumsy, imprecise, overshadowed by the knowledge that the dog would walk to that door again, and that she would be powerless to stop the reaction it triggered in her. When the hour arrived, he rose from his place near the window with the same quiet certainty. He padded toward the hallway, his movements steady and unhurried. Elena braced herself, gripping the edge of the counter. Her vision blurred slightly, not from tears, she had run out of those months ago, but from a kind of pressure that tightened behind her eyes. The dog sat. The house held its breath. For a moment, Elena wanted to call him away, to forcefully pull him from that spot, as if his presence there might crack open a part of her she had spent months trying to keep sealed shut. She wanted to tell him, though she never spoke it aloud, that the person he was waiting for wasn't coming home, that the routine he seemed to sense no longer belonged to this house, that she couldn't bear to see that quiet expectation mirrored by a creature who had no idea that the world had already broken her once and had left her terrified it might do so again. But she said nothing. She stayed still, and the dog continued to wait, patient and steady, as if responding to a rhythm that had outlived its source. In that moment, something inside her shifted. Not enough to be called change, not yet, but enough to send the faintest tremor through the walls she had built around herself. Enough to remind her that grief was not a silent room she could lock herself inside forever. Not when a living creature kept standing at the door her son used to walk through. Not when that simple act, quiet, instinctive, unknowing, pulled her back into a part of her life she had been desperately trying not to remember. The house stayed quiet, but the silence no longer felt still. Something had begun to move. The next mornings unfolded with a rhythm that felt both familiar and unsettling. Elena moved through the quiet rooms with the same practiced detachment, but now there was a subtle tension threaded through her days, as if she were waiting for something she didn't want to face. The dog followed her with his usual calm patience, but she could sense a new pattern forming in him, a quiet expectation that unsettled the fragile balance she had maintained for months. He spent more time near the front hallway, lingering close to the door even outside the usual hour. Sometimes he lay curled at the edge of the rug, head on his paws, eyes half closed but ears still slightly lifted, as though listening for footsteps that the world no longer offered. Other times he paced gently between the living room and the front entryway, not restless but unsure, guided by some instinctive pull that neither of them fully understood. Elena tried to ignore it. She told herself that dogs latch on to new routines easily, that he had simply chosen that spot because it was warmer, or because he liked the light that streamed through the narrow window beside the door. She tried convincing herself of anything that made sense, anything that didn't force her to confront the ache that tightened her chest each time she saw him waiting like that. But the hours always circled back to that same moment.
Late afternoon, when the shadows lengthened and the air inside the house shifted in a way that felt almost physical. That used to be her favorite time of day, when she listened for the sound of her son's hurried footsteps on the front steps, the soft thud of his backpack hitting the floor, the muffled hum of his voice drifting through the hallway as he hustled toward his room. Now it was the hour she dreaded most, the one that hollowed her out from the inside. The dog felt it too. On the fourth day, he reached the door before the hour even arrived. He stood there, motionless, as though following a pull he couldn't resist. Elena watched him from the kitchen, unable to move, unable to breathe deeply. She felt the familiar pressure rise through her chest, the dull, persistent ache of something unprocessed forcing its way toward the surface. She tried to fill the time with meaningless tasks, rinsing dishes that weren't dirty, rearranging items in the refrigerator, emptying the trash even though it wasn't full. But the walls of the house seemed to close in, narrowing her space, shortening her breath. And then, like clockwork, the dog shifted, straightened, and settled into that quiet posture of waiting. She felt something inside her falter. It was the way he held his body, still but not rigid, patient but not expectant. It was a kind of gentle attention that made her chest tighten in a way she hadn't felt since the funeral, when the last of her strength had slipped through her fingers. She stood there, staring at him, gripping the counter to steady herself, and in that fragile moment she realized that this wasn't about a dog following noise or habit. It was about a void in the house that had been left untouched for months, a void that the dog now occupied simply by standing where her son once stood every afternoon. She turned away quickly, retreating to the back of the house, desperate to outrun the familiar tremble that threatened to rise in her throat. But the rooms followed her. The quiet clung to her. The dog stayed at the door, never calling her to him, never needing to. His presence was enough. As the days passed, she found herself anticipating his movement even as she tried to dread it. She noticed the exact moment when he lifted his head, when his ears shifted towards some distant sound only he could interpret. She found herself pausing in the middle of simple tasks, listening for his steps, feeling the ripple of tension inside her each time he rose from the floor with that same solemn purpose. On the seventh afternoon, something unexpected happened. Elena was in the hallway, folding a blanket she had washed earlier, when she felt movement beside her. The dog brushed lightly against her leg, just a small instinctive contact, before moving past her toward the door. He sat in the same spot, but this time he looked back at her over his shoulder, not with expectation, but with a quiet awareness that softened the edges of the moment. It wasn't a call, it wasn't a sign, it was simply a gentle acknowledgement, an unspoken suggestion that she didn't have to stand behind him, far from the place she most feared. Her breath caught. She froze, blankets still clutched in her hands, the fabric pressed to her chest like a barrier she wasn't ready to lower. She didn't step closer, she didn't cross the distance between them, but her eyes drifted toward the door, toward the narrow strip of light on the floor, toward the memory of sneakers thudding against wood, toward the ache that had lived so long inside her that it felt like part of her bones. The dog stayed there longer than usual that day, as if feeling something shift in the air behind him. Elena turned away before the moment swallowed her whole, but she walked slower this time. She didn't retreat to the farthest corner of the house. She lingered in the living room, closer to him than she had ever allowed herself to be during that hour. That night she barely slept. She lay in bed staring at the ceiling, the weight of her thoughts pressing heavily against her ribs. Memories she had avoided for months drifted through her mind, mundane, ordinary moments that struck her harder than any dramatic recollection ever could. The sound of a zipper on a jacket, the clatter of dishes after dinner, a faint hint of citrus from the shampoo he used. She tried to push them away, but they came back sharper, clearer, as though the dog's silent waiting had loosened something inside her that she could no longer restrain. In the morning she found him already by the hallway. Not sitting, not waiting, just watching her move through the house with eyes that held no judgment, no expectation, just a simple presence, steady and grounding. She avoided meeting his gaze for too long, but she didn't turn away completely. She spent the day moving aimlessly, unable to find her footing. The house felt different now, not louder, not brighter, but unsettled, like a place where the air carried remnants of something just beginning to stir. She felt restless, haunted by the image of the dog waiting at the door, by the unspoken truth that lingered in that small ritual. When the afternoon came, she stood in the kitchen already bracing herself. She gripped the countertop again, nails pressing into the edge, heartbeat quickening in that quietly devastating way she had come to recognize. She told herself she wouldn't look. She told herself she didn't need to see it again. But when the dog moved past her, soft paws brushing lightly against the floorboards, she couldn't stop her eyes from following. He walked to the door, sat, and waited. This time Elena didn't turn away. She stayed where she was, breath shallow, the familiar ache rising like a tide she couldn't fight. The weight of months pressed into her chest, tightening, burning, threatening to break through the moment she let her guard slip even slightly. And for the first time, she didn't run from it. Something inside her cracked, not open, not fully, but enough for a thin thread of truth to slip through. Her son wasn't coming home. The dog wasn't waiting for him. He was simply following a faint trace of routine left behind in the bones of the house, one Elena had been too afraid to face until now. The silence deepened around her, no longer empty, but trembling with something raw and unfinished. She stood there, hands shaking slightly, unable to step forward but unable to step back. The dog remained still. The hour passed. The house breathed. And for the first time in months, the grief didn't feel distant. It felt present, real, impossible to avoid. Something was shifting, slow and unsteady, but unstoppable all the same. The following days unfolded with a kind of muted heaviness, as if each hour carried a quiet pressure that Elena could no longer push aside. She moved through her routines with the same deliberate slowness, but now there was an awareness that clung to her. An uncomfortable, fragile consciousness of the empty space she had been circling around for months. The dog had settled into his own pattern, moving through the house with calm predictability, but each afternoon, without fail, he returned to the door. He didn't scratch, he didn't whine, he didn't search for anything. He simply sat, as though honoring a rhythm left behind by someone he had never met. Elena tried avoiding the moment by leaving the house during that hour. She drove aimlessly once, circling neighborhoods she didn't recognize, letting the motion of the car numb her thoughts. But when she returned, the dog was sitting at the door anyway, tail resting still on the floor, ears slightly raised at the sound of her keys. He had waited through the hour, unbothered by her absence.